We're going to begin with a look at the current dynamics in the automotive market. There's no one better able to provide this insight than Tyson Jominy, Vice President of Data and Analytics with J.D. Power and Power Information Network. As the lead sales and pricing analyst, Tyson will help us make sense of the latest sales data, how the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and inventory challenges are affecting manufacturers, and the most important trends shaping our industry's future. We entered 2021 with renewed optimism for recovery from the pandemic. So what happened? As we sit here today, we're looking at a most unusual set of circumstances. Demand is strong, production is down, prices are at an all-time high, inventory at an all-time low. Tyson, help us make sense of this market.
Well, I could certainly try to make sense. I mean, what I think we're seeing is a great convergence. We're seeing a convergence of low production, of very challenged, fragile supply chain mixed with extraordinary demand from consumers. And that's producing record profits for automakers. It's producing record profits for dealers. At the same time, we're seeing a fundamental shift in who the buyers are of these vehicles and even what they're buying. It's all changing at the same time, and it's all come together at this exact moment. And that's creating this new environment that we're seeing here.
Yeah, really, it is new, right? It is extraordinary. Let's unpack that a little bit further. You mentioned a couple of things I want to drill down on. One, the supply chain, right? I mean, I think anybody, even a casual observer of the automotive industry, is familiar with the lack of auto-grade chips, right? Microchips that are missing from vehicles, really, and sidelining production, right? So tell us a little bit about what's happening there in your view.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's the microchip issue we're all familiar with, because cars and all vehicles require so many microchips right now. And the auto companies are competing with the tech companies and others out there for limited capacity of microchips. But it's not just even microchips. I mean, if it was just that, maybe we would have a solution pretty quickly. I mean, it's resin for paint, it's tires. And there's even a story where one individual got COVID in a wiring harness plant that brought down that plant, which brought down an entire automaker's production for the month. So it's kind of this big convergence of these ideas coming together at the same time.
So it's not just chips, it's other elements of the supply chain. I also noticed that there's a huge backup at the Port of Long Beach, right? So there's a bunch of container ships that are backed up, that can't be unloaded. There's probably, I would imagine, auto parts and maybe finished vehicles floating out there in the Pacific. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have cars trapped out at sea. We've got cars trapped at port that can't get out. I mean, it's kind of hitting us in all these places. And the supply chain, again, it's so fragile because it's a global supply chain, and this is a global pandemic and a global issue that we've been seeing. If it was just isolated to one or two countries or continents, perhaps, there'd be a much quicker route out of this. But due to how widespread the coronavirus panic became, it really took its toll on the supply chain pretty much.
Yeah. So I want to come to the demand side. So you've established, hey, look, there's a supply problem. So what is happening with demand? I mean, demand seems pretty strong. As you mentioned, you also talked about, maybe a new type of customer in the marketplace. What's happening in the marketplace on the demand side?
Well, first of all, demand and sales are completely uncoupled at this point. What we see in the monthly sales reports and the quarterly sales reports do not reflect demand. I mean, we lost 2.5 million sales last year, and we're on pace to lose 2 million sales this year. There's a lot of consumers on the sideline that are waiting for cars. But back in April, actually, we saw the industry SAAR hit 18.4 million as consumers that we were starting to meet that pent-up demand. It was starting to come back right as we were running out of vehicles. 18.4 million is the fourth highest SAAR of all time. I mean, it only trails 9/11, Keep America Rolling campaign that GM rolled out, and employee pricing for all. Those are the only events that had higher SAARs than what we saw.
That's extraordinary. And I just want to, for folks who aren't necessarily familiar with the industry, SAAR, you're talking about a seasonally adjusted annual sales rate, right? And so that's an annual number that you're looking at, and that's among the highest it's ever been on the demand side.
The fourth highest of all time on an annualized basis. But within 4 months, we actually fell down to what I would consider recessionary sales levels. I mean, we went from the highest of highs now down to September. Our SAR was actually, in September 21, was below the SAR of September '08. And if you recall what happened then, that's when Lehman Brothers collapsed. That was sort of the height of the Great Recession. Our volumes right now are below that, even though I just said a minute ago, demand is off the charts. We have high demand, and it's not just that we're selling, the demand is high. Who is buying has changed. And as you alluded to, we've seen a wholesale change in the buyer in the auto industry for the first time in arguably 50 years. Baby boomers have been supplanted by millennials, and this is one of the most exciting dynamics because we have a new buying demographic in the auto industry. It started in April of 2020, and we thought, well, it's just kind of a blip. But it's only progressed so that now, as of last month, millennials are 36% of the buyers in the industry compared to 28% for baby boomers.
Wait a minute. So there used to be a view that millennials won't buy cars, right? That baby boomers are going to be the last great consumers of automobiles, and the millennials will not be. So what you're telling me is millennials are in the marketplace in a strong way. Why is that? They
did the American thing. It just took them a while longer to get there, but they coupled up, they procreated, they moved to the suburbs, they have soccer games on Saturdays just like Gen X and baby boomers before them. It just took them a while longer to get there. They don't love their phones more than cars, they love cars. And they're now the #1 buying demographic in 17 of our 27 segments. They're the #1 in large pickups, they're the #1 in most cars, and they're #1 in minivans and 3-row crossovers.
Amazing. So how does the rest of the year look? So you've got this demand and supply uncoupled. What can we expect through the end of 2021 and into 2022?
Well, the good news is that inventory can't hurt us anymore. And I know that's sort of a contradictory statement here because we've been talking so much about inventory. But our inventory has really what's been hurting us recently. Sales can't be impacted anymore. So from here, looking into Q4 and into 22, we're going to see basically supply determining the sales pace. So as we get chips, as we're able to produce vehicles and get those out there, we've got 4.5 million consumers sitting on the sideline between retail and fleet. And as vehicles come in, they're going to buy those. So the inventory situation isn't going to change in 21. And I'm going to tell you, John, it's really not going to change throughout most of 22. Really Q4 22 before we start to see inventory begin to build.
Wow, so continued storm clouds and challenges there for most of 2022.
But is it? I mean, we're seeing record transaction prices, record OEM profits, record dealer profits. I mean, the amount of money consumers are spending in the market is up 20% from 2019.
Yeah, so that's a great way to put it, right? So in other words, this uncoupling actually is creating opportunities for manufacturers, for dealers, and for consumers, again, as the supply chain issues work themselves out, which raises another question for me. Will the current model that we see or that we saw before the pandemic continue to be the current model? In other words, I would have argued before the pandemic that manufacturers and dealers were comfortable with a fairly high level of inventory to be able to provide consumers with choices at dealerships. Do you think that manufacturers and dealers will get comfortable with a new lower level of inventory, for example? Will it change how manufacturers think about the retail side of the business?
Well, I think the longer it goes on, the more comfortable everyone's going to get. And so as we've been looking now, this will be a 3-year event by the time we get to the end of 22, basically. And that's a long time. There's a lot of auto executives and retailing executives that are going to grow up and move into management and executive positions that are used to this new normal. And so the longer it goes on, the more likely it is that the paradigm will shift. But after great events, that have impacted the industry, whether it's the Great Recession or the Keep America Rolling campaign after 9/11, the industry has reevaluated how it goes to market. And there's been a lot of introspection at this time. I mean, you talk about digital retailing for dealers. That was the only way to do business in 2020 for most dealers. How quickly they adapted and learned to do that. And now we're talking about lower inventory levels and higher transaction prices. The dealers, they adapt so quickly. They're such great business people. And this opportunity is opening up both for automakers and for dealers. At the same time, the kind of vehicles we're changing very rapidly, what we're buying. I mean, EVs are up to 3% now. And so what we're buying is changing. At the same time, we're getting this opportunity to reevaluate, the whole retailing experience.
Yeah, I love that idea of transformation, not only in the vehicle itself and in the services that are provided, but also in the retail space. I want to come back to that in a second, but one more question, sort of in the near term. We talked about record high transaction prices right now. Can we expect that those, as the supply chain works itself out and as demand increases, that those high transaction prices might come down a little bit or stabilize? What's your view about that?
Yeah, we would expect those to probably stabilize, if not come back slightly. We've seen incentive spending by automakers drop from over $4,000 a unit to $1,700 a unit as inventory fell. And we've seen the number of consumers paying above MSRP right now is 84% of consumers are paying near or above MSRP. And so these factors are very likely not to continue as inventory starts to come back, as we meet this pent-up demand. So as we start to really exit 22, we should start to see those pressures come down.
I see. And I want to come back to your point about electrification. So let's look at the trends that we're seeing in the marketplace and in the industry generally. So you talked about electrification. Before we come back to that specifically, what are some of the other trends in addition to more electrification in the new vehicle fleet? What are some of the other trends you're tracking with regard to the auto market?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we're seeing the continuation of the SUV dominance of the industry. I mean, SUV penetration is closing in on 60%. So consumers continue to want SUVs of every flavor, every size, and every niche. Of course, Bronco being all new and the Bronco Sport focusing on that hardcore off-road market. So we'll see a lot of trend toward that in vehicles. But in general, consumers are open to the idea of electrification. We saw vehicles like the RAV4 Prime come to market, and the RAV4 Hybrid and the CR-V Hybrid, and hybrid share is taking off. And because we finally put those kind of powertrains in the vehicles that people want. I mean, we want SUVs. And as we start to put alternative powertrains into the kinds of vehicles that people want, we're seeing consumer responses very high to that combination.
Yeah, so that's a really important point, right? So more availability across more segments is going to obviously increase sales, right? So I noticed, for example, the ID.4, the Volkswagen product, really seems to be, targeted at right smack in the middle of the heart of the market, right? Kind of that, what would you call that, a compact or mid-size SUV. You look at the Mustang E, is in addition to the Toyota products you mentioned. I mean, there's a lot going on, right? So that's good for consumers, more choice, right, in the electric drive space. You mentioned 3%. There are goals out there that are much more audacious and much more far-reaching. For example, a view that we might be able to get to 40 to 50% of new vehicle sales being electric drive by the end of this decade. So effectively 8 years from now. So 3% to 40 or 50%. What does it take, in your view, to really reach those types of levels, if you think we can?
What's interesting is we actually took a look at electrified, or electric specifically, pricing in $10,000 buckets. And there is an electric vehicle in every price bucket, every car from under 20K up to over 80K. And likewise for SUVs. If your goal is just to buy an SUV or a car that's electric, it's there at every price point up the ladder. So why isn't it catching on necessarily even faster than it's going? Well, because consumers are 49.5% loyal to their brands. So we've got to get more brands offering more EVs at more price points. I mean, the original EV idea we had was, let's put an electric powertrain inside a hatchback. And if there's one thing Americans didn't trust more than electric vehicles, it was hatchbacks. Right. And so we put the two together and thought, it'd be like the time that chocolate and peanut butter came together to make Reese's peanut butter cups. But the reality, it didn't work. And so Tesla showed a great way to do it, which is electric cars can be sexy, they can be fast and fun. And so we see a lot of automakers mirroring that. But what we're still missing is that middle part of the market, like I mentioned, with CR-V hybrid and RAV hybrid. That middle part of the market put an electric powertrain in the vehicles that most consumers are buying. Number 1 and 2 segments are midsize SUV, the 3-row crossovers, and compact SUV. As we start to put electric powertrains there, that will be a very big step forward in the electric penetration.
Yeah, so I've seen forecasts, for example, that we might be somewhere around 130 or so different electrified products in the marketplace by mid-decade, and so that seems to be responsive to the point you're making. And so there we go, right? Sort of more availability responds to consumer demand, and we can make significant progress. You know, I know that you know, you're focused a lot on the sales market, but you know, there are other elements that need to be, other building blocks that need to be put in place, right? So, for example, do we have sufficient charging and hydrogen fueling, for example, for the levels of electrification that we hope to achieve by mid-decade and by the end of the decade, in your view?
Yeah, at J.D. Power, we just completed a quintet of EV studies. All 5 of them, basically the same message came through from EV owners and intenders. Infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. We need to see charging units. We need to know that they're there. We need to have the confidence that they're going to be at the right place and offering the right type of charging. It's not just, is there a charger where I need it? It's got to be the right kind, the right speed of charger. And so that message came loud and clear from consumers directly to J.D. Power.
I want to come to another trend. You know, when we look at electrification, you mentioned, you know, the continued strength of the SUV market. You know, we're also seeing more and more advanced safety systems coming into the marketplace, as well as, you know, steps toward more highly automated vehicles. Primarily, I would think maybe in the near term in the fleet space. What's your view on what customers are and aren't buying in the, say, the safety tech space right now?
We've seen a lot of the advanced driving assist systems skyrocket in penetration. Your blind spot warnings, your front collision warnings, your rear cross traffic warning systems that automakers are putting in their vehicles go from single-digit penetrations to 30, 50, 60% penetration of vehicles in the span of about 5 years. So those are going extraordinarily fast. Most automakers are making a lot of these safety suites standard, which is really helping. Now, do consumers know they have these features? Do they know what's working when the vehicle starts vibrating? Do they know it's because they're about to back into something or for another reason? Perhaps explaining these systems to consumers would be another great step, but we are seeing rapid adoption of these technologies.
Yeah, you know, that's a really good point. Rapid adoption, that's good. More technology, more safety. But I do think you make a really good point, educating the consumer, making sure that they're aware of what the vehicle is capable of, and perhaps even what it's not capable of. Right. In the safety tech space would be really important. What about another trend we often talk about in the auto industry, the shift from maybe ownership to sharing, to access? You know, maybe the pandemic has slowed that down a little bit, maybe not. What's your take on how consumers will consume mobility, personal mobility, going forward?
Well, what we saw in the pandemic was the areas where your Ubers and Lyfts have the strongest presence. It's also the area with the greatest mass transportation systems, New York, Chicago, San Francisco. And so we saw a lot of consumers move out of mass transportation into the Ubers. But for the rest of us, you know, the suburb dwelling rest of us out there, the idea during the pandemic of getting in someone else's car was, you know, anathema. Like who could envision that? Now, I think that's all kind of a short-term disruption there. Over long term, there'll probably be a greater emphasis on the shared space, reaching more consumers with it. Certainly, as the platforms mature and we see more adoption and more trials there. I mean, I don't know about you, but my parents haven't even attempted to take an Uber anywhere. Right. And meanwhile, I'm asking my wife, can I put my son in an Uber to go to practice? And she's right. Like, no way. You know, so they have two extremes, and I'm kind of in the middle, being the one that uses it pretty frequently. So long term, there's probably a trend toward that. But you know, at the end of the day, you know, back to the soccer example, you know, when you've got soccer practice on Saturday and you've got to get somewhere else after that and you're running around, you need you need your vehicle that can haul all your stuff and be with you. The idea that we're all going to give up our cars is pretty far-fetched. I think the personal ownership of cars are going to continue until we're going to grow old with our own individual cars,
Right.
John.
Tyson, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.